This is the Middle-earth philosopher, where I took a look at ideas, people, and relationships within Middle-earth and tried to examine them from a philosophical point of view from within that world. I wanted to take somewhat of an in-depth psychological look on the character of Feanor, arguably one of the most influential characters in Tolkien's universe, as well as probably the most controversial. Both within the book The Silmarillion and by many fans, Feanor is often regarded as someone who is either insane, evil, or just prideful and arrogant character. However, I think that is a somewhat shallow interpretation. So to begin with, to understand the character of Feanor, we must first understand the character of his father, Finwe. Now I'm going to assume that you are probably already a Tolkien fan or have somewhat of a knowledge of this, so I'm going to try not to go too in depth into this. Finwe was one of the first 3 elves to go west after the elves were born in Middle-earth. They went as ambassadors because when the elves first saw the Valar for the first time, they were terrified of them, based on their experiences with Melkor, who, unknown by the Valar, had been kidnapping and terrorizing the elves when they were first created, long before the Valar first became aware of them. Finwe had been one of the 3 leaders of the elves at that time, and volunteered to go west to get a reading on the Valar's intentions towards the elves, if they were friends or enemies. Upon arriving in Valinor, he discovers that the intentions of the Valar were indeed good towards the elves, so when they returned back to the elves of Middle-earth, they had encouraged them all to follow the Valar back into Valinor, where they would be safe and protected. The journey of this first and long migration of the elves is a whole other story in and of itself, but needless to say, when the elves finally arrived to Valinor, they formed 3 tribes: the Vanyar, the Noldor, and the Teleri. Finwe was considered the High King of the Noldor, who were considered the most knowledgeable and the most industrial of all the elves in the West. For uncounted years, centuries, millennia, I don't know what to describe it as, the elves prosper and they grow and they become more civilized and more advanced than their kin who had remained in Middle-earth during the migration. It is during this time of prosperity that Finwe marries and has a son named Feanor. The birth of his son is considered a joyous event by Finwe and his wife Miriel. However, the birthing had been so intense and so taxing on Miriel's body that she eventually gives up her life and essentially dies, and is the first being, period, to die in Middle-earth at that time. And this death has a tremendous effect on Finwe. Because Finwe loved his wife so much, he comes to see Feanor, their one and only son, as the last remnant of what they had together and what they could have been, because they had wanted to have more children in Valinor, but that was obviously cut short now. And even though Finwe does indeed later on remarry to one of the Vanyar elves and gives birth to 2 other sons, Fingolfin and Finarfin, it still does not ease the power and the legacy of his first love, and by extension of that, his first son. And because of this, there is a clear sense of favoritism that he holds over Feanor, though this is not due to any kind of malice towards his stepfamily. And this is where Feanor begins to take center stage. Because of the great love of his father that he has for him, Feanor feels that he is the one and only true son of Finwe, and he has no problem making sure that everyone else, especially his stepbrothers, are aware of this. During his growth and his time in Valinor, Feanor begins to learn the skills of crafting, just like all the other Noldor, but it becomes quite clear that he's extraordinarily gifted at it, much more than any of the other elves, and arguably any other of the other spirits in Valinor, short of the Valar themselves. He perfects the making of jewels and creates one of the first languages of the Eldar that live in Valinor. The pinnacle of Feanor's skill is the creation of Silmarils, 3 large jewels that contain the light of the 2 great trees of Valinor. These trees were made by the Valar themselves and were considered to be among the most powerful and influential objects in all of Middle-earth and Arda at that time. So that someone was able to capture that power and that light and then encapsulate it within an object was considered extraordinary. For his skill, Feanor was widely recognized as the most gifted elf in all of Valinor. However, he was also regarded as the most arrogant and disliked elf as well, in particular by his stepfamily. Feanor made no secret of the contempt that he held his stepfamily in. It seems like, as far as he was concerned, that Miriel was the one true wife of his father, and that for that reason, he was the better son and the only son of the family. Fingolfin and Finarfin were outsiders. They were not true Noldor in his own eyes. Some elves thought that this came from a hidden evil nature within Feanor. Others thought that he seems like he was just kind of a spoiled brat, whose father simply never said no to him. And it is implied that Finwe never spoke out against his son, even though others had implored him to do so. Yet this was all manageable up until the point where Melkor, who was later known as Morgoth, begins to corrupt the Noldor, enhancing with lies their perception of themselves as the best elves in all of Valinor, and that the Valar were trying to keep them there in order to keep them from controlling all of Middle-earth for themselves. Melkor did this because he was always envious of the creations of Uru-Iluvatar, the one god of the Tolkienverse, and though Melkor himself was a creation of that god, he still believed and felt that he should be the supreme being, or at the very least, wanted to rule a world of his own. But the fact remained that he was not able to create anything beautiful at least. So he actively tried to sabotage and wage war against his other kin in order to get this control, to get what he wanted. When he was finally captured, before the elves were brought over to Valinor, he was taken into an imprisonment in the far west of Valinor and was kept there for ages, but had been let out on parole because that had been the agreement by the Valar. During his parole, as you can call it, he went around Valinor and saw how much it had changed. He saw how the elves there had made it more beautiful and more grand than the Valar themselves had imagined, and this inflamed his rage and his jealousy. Therefore, he aimed to ruin this through corruption before active betrayal. And the primary target for this was Feanor, because of the fact that he created the most powerful and beautiful objects in all of Valinor, if not all of Middle-earth, the 3 Silmaril jewels. He tells the brothers that each one of them is plotting against the other, and they all believe this. In particular, Feanor, because Melkor essentially tells him that Fingolfin and Finarfin plan to supplant him as his father's first and only son. This only looks confirmed when Feanor arrives to ask his father about this and finds Fingolfin there trying to convince his father to rein in Feanor, because he too had heard rumors of the same thing. And Feanor just isn't having it, threatening him at sword point that if he tries to supplant his role in his father's heart and within the Noldor again, that he'll outright kill him. This act is considered so grievous and so controversial that the Valar call Feanor to them to be judged. Feanor is exiled and takes his immediate family, as long as other elves who follow after him, to an isolated fortress somewhere else in Valinor. Yet perhaps the most disturbing part about this is that his father follows after him, laying down his crown as High King so that he can follow after his son, his and Miriel's son, so that he may not be alone. At this point, Feanor again speaks with Melkor, and Melkor urges him to form an alliance with him against the Valar, but more so for Feanor to give to Melkor the 3 Silmaril jewels so that he can hold them in safekeeping. Feanor is well aware of the envy and the wonder that many in Valinor hold towards the Silmaril jewels that he himself had made. So when he hears Melkor speak of this, he sees through his deception and lies and sends him away in shame. However, it's never a good idea to piss off a Valar, and Melkor remembers this, swearing vengeance. Time passes, and Feanor is eventually recalled to the Valar to be rejudged for his actions, and this time by his own family as well. However, Fingolfin is willing to forgive him, and even swears allegiance to him, a full brother rather than a half-brother. And Feanor seems to actually believe this and go along with it, giving hope in everyone's hearts that perhaps this feud within the Noldor elves has finally been resolved, and everything could go back to normal again. However, it's at this time that Melkor kills the 2 trees, and also kills Feanor's father when he raids the fortress and tries to get the jewels, and also kill Feanor himself. According to survivors of the attack, Finwe was the only elf who did not run from Melkor when he came, and thus Melkor killed him outright. Feanor is beyond grieved at hearing this. He simply goes mad, both in rage and in sadness, saying that if the Valar had not called him, that he would have been there to defeat Morgoth and protect his father. Sometime after this, Feanor, now considered the second High King of the Noldor, calls upon his people to return to Middle-earth in pursuit of the now named Morgoth, both to kill him and to reclaim the jewels that Morgoth stolen and had killed his father for. And at this point, this is full power Feanor. His words have so much power that most of his tribe are immediately convinced to follow after him, also inheriting the rage and madness that Feanor himself feels. This is symbolized by the so-called Oath of Feanor, where he and his 7 sons swear that they will recover all the 3 jewels that he had made and that Morgoth had stolen, and would kill anyone, no matter who or what they were, to get them back. Now, the only ones who weren't convinced of this were the Noldor nobility themselves, with both Finarfin and fingolfin trying to convince Feanor to slow down and cool down and heed his actions more wisely. Also, too, other nobility also had similar ideas of going back to Middle-earth for similar reasons, but they still did not trust Feanor as their leader. Despite these obstacles, Feanor eventually convinces everyone to follow after him. So he leads the Noldor to the Teleri, where, being sailors themselves, have ships that can sail them all across the seas back to Middle-earth, making it a lot simpler. Yet the Teleri, like Fingolfin Finarfin, also try to calm down Feanor and to think more wisely about his actions. However, Feanor, being impatient, decides against this and tries to take the ships by force. This leads to the first battle of elf on elf, called the Battle of Alqualande. During this battle, elf kills elf, as the saying implies, and it is eventually won when the Noldor get reinforcements from Fingolfin and Finarfin, who arrived late and were unaware of the reasons of what had happened, just that their brothers were being attacked. This eventually leads to what is called the Judgement of Mandos, where the Valar essentially curse all the Noldor and anyone who chooses to follow after them or under them to be doomed to failure at all that they do, and that they will suffer greatly because of this crime that they had committed against their own kind. That betrayal shall become their lot, and that loss shall ever hound them. Moreover, Feanor's immediate family is permanently banned from Valinor. Finarfin swears off Feanor's quest and returns to Valinor, both rejecting Feanor as his High King, and I think as his brother as well, and returns to the portion of his people to seek forgiveness, which the Valar do. However, everyone else still chooses to follow after him and get the jewels back and swear vengeance upon Morgoth. However, now Feanor has grown suspicious of Fingolfin and his followers, and decides to abandon them as well, taking the ships and sailing across the seas to Middle-earth, leaving Fingolfin to cross the ice in the high north of the world. When he arrives, he finds that war is already happening in Middle-earth as well, Morgoth having attacked the other elves that were living in Middle-earth that had not gone to Valinor in the first place. And it is during this campaign that Feanor eventually dies from mortal wounds that he receives while fighting Balrogs. Now, these are some of the basic facts about the character, and it's for these reasons that Feanor is often considered one of the evil characters of the book. And this is where I'm going to take a deeper dive into his character to see if that's actually true. To begin with, I do think that there is some degree of being misunderstood at play here. Feanor is named Feanor by his mother, but that was not his original name. In fact, his father had named him Kuru Finwe, before his mother named him Feanor, which means Spirit of Fire, and this is the name that Feanor eventually chose. Now, whether Feanor could actually recall Miriel's face or not, or who she was on some level, I don't know. But I think the fact that he chose her name over his father's name shows a certain level of reverence and devotion to his mother, and I think this is what motivates him to have such hostility towards his stepfamily as well. While it's quite clear that Feanor does indeed love his father, I think he regards his second marriage as a mistake, or perhaps even a betrayal of his mother's memory. This can be a common occurrence in marriages that had previous kids in another relationship, and now the kids have to get used to a new parent and new stepfamily as well. Another factor at play here is the fact that Finwe never seems to correct or rebuke Feanor. Indeed, it seems like that is the last thing that he ever wants to do, and went as far as resign from being High King of his people in order to follow his son when he goes into exile. And I think this is because even though Finwe did remarry, he also never recovered from Miriel's death. That shouldn't be too surprising, since he is the first one ever in that universe to experience such a loss. There is no books, manuals, or anyone who could have helped him through that experience. So Feanor is a living memory of his love for Miriel. Therefore, obviously, he would have a special place in his heart for him. And it's also implied that disputes had risen between Feanor and his brothers in the past that Finwe had never gotten involved with. But it's also implied that it seems like he got away with quite a bit. This seemingly both plays into the arrogance that grows within Feanor, as well as his love for his father as well. Two contrasting points of character, but that exist in the same person. While a lot of people held Feanor in suspicion, having ill will and dark intents in his heart, the fact that he loved his father was never questioned. At no point does Feanor ever speak out against his father, nor try to take rulership from him. And I think, in a way, Feanor believes that he was violated twice by Melkor. One being the stealing of the Silmarils, but more so being the murder of his father, taking the person he loved most from him. Does this excuse his arrogance and his pride? Not entirely. As mentioned earlier, Feanor had received much praise for his works, because he was making things and perfecting things that no other elf had done before him. Yet, it is Feanor's reaction to this praise that caused so much distrust within the family, as the step-family starts to believe that Feanor just wants to manipulate and control them. The fact that they went to Middle-earth at all, even with Finarfin returning, was just because of loyalty to Finwe, not to Feanor himself, but with perhaps the exception of fingolfin. None of these things strike me as necessarily evil, but rather they strike me as being immature. I think, like his father, Feanor never really mastered his own emotions, and it was usually the other way around, where his emotions usually mastered him. Certain people could keep those in check, like his father and his wife, Nerdinel, for a time while he was with her, but for the most part, he had little control over his emotions, despite his great discipline and skill in creation and in fighting as well. Some might argue that this is Feanor being a narcissist. However, I believe that rather Feanor is focused on his needs and his goals only. Family is mostly a second priority to him, at least step-family, and he's willing to go to whatever means necessary to accomplish his main ends. Because of this drive, Feanor believes in himself and his destiny, and nothing, not even the Valar, can convince him otherwise. In fact, when the curse is pronounced upon the Noldor for their killing of other elves at Alcalande, Feanor in fact rebukes the Valar themselves, saying that they're going to follow after him at some point in the future, which eventually does happen. And this both speaks to his ego, his pride, and perhaps some hidden power that the Valar themselves were not even aware of. And this is perhaps one of the biggest ironies about Feanor, that he is a master at manipulating the emotions of others, but never masters his own emotions in the process, which is what eventually gets him killed. And it's after his father's murder that rage becomes Feanor's most prominent emotion and what he's regarded most for later on in history. A characteristic that is passed down to everyone who follows after him within the Noldor clan, and makes that portion of the Noldor the most distrusted and the most dangerous of all the elves that live in the west of Middle-earth. It's because of these elements that I think Feanor is something of a chaotic evil, in that I don't think he is evil by nature, but that the circumstances eventually mold him into that. Yes, he did make choices, and that there were consequences for those choices, but at the same time, there were elements at work that were pushing him into making those choices. And if those elements had not been there, or if perhaps circumstances had been different, it's possible that he may have chosen something different. After all, Feanor expresses no real desire to return to Middle-earth until after his father was killed and Morgoth had stolen his jewels. Moreover, despite the tragedy that surrounds him and that he causes later on throughout his legacy, there are two facts that also remain on the opposite side of this. That number one, that his actions are what motivate the Valar to eventually become less laissez-faire in their dealings with Middle-earth and to become more active in taking care of Morgoth finally and permanently. And second, being the creation of the Silmarils, which held the last remaining light of the perfection that the Valar had created that yet remained in that world, since Morgoth had destroyed the source of that light back in Valinor. And without that action, the light of the Valar would have been lost forever. So Feanor's legacy, as well as his character, is a mixed bag. There is clearly evil that has happened with it, and that has happened because of it. But at the same time, there was some good of it as well as some gray aspects. And it's these nuances that make Feanor one of the most interesting characters within the world of Middle-earth.